Shalom, Rabbi,
Shalom Uracha.
and thank you for taking the time for this part of my program, Profiles of Faith. We're here today, August 2nd, Yud Gimel of Cheshvan, with Rabbi Joel Roth in Englewood, New Jersey. Rabbi Dr. Roth, how do you prefer to be called?
Well, all of my students call me Rabbi. You're welcome to call me Joel if you wish.
Well, Rabbi Dr. Joel Roth is a little long, so Rabbi will suffice. A little introduction. Rabbi Roth has a prominent role in the Rabbinic Assembly, which is the rabbinical body of the conservative movement. As a former chair of the Assembly's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, he has helped frame issues of Jewish law and tradition over many years. Rabbi Roth serves as professor of Talmud and Jewish law and has been the dean of the Rabbinic School at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the JTS. In 2006, Rabbi Roth took over as chair of the Hebrew Language Department at the JTS. He is also Rosh Yeshiva of the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, Israel. But for me, Rabbi Roth has been a guide and often a source of clarity in learning about the legal nuance of the Talmud and debating some elements in the evolution of Jewish observance. Rabbi, while my theme is about tradition and its transmission through the generations, you are one of the top experts in the world about Talmud and the legal structure of our Halachic code. But first, I understand that you were born in Detroit to Eastern European parents who came before the war, Orthodox grandparents, and an observant dad who had to work on Shabbos to support the family. I heard of such stories before. Can you tell us about your childhood, your family, and the important markers of your life?
Well, as a child, my parents enrolled me in the Hebrew school system of the city of Detroit, which was sort of a non-denominational afternoon Hebrew school system. I was not a day school student in any way. And I went through that entire system of the United Hebrew Schools, which had an elementary school, a high school, and a midrashah. And I also, for years, taught in the United Hebrew School system in the city of Detroit. My family lived in a two-family home in the city of Detroit, and upstairs from us, my aunt and uncle lived. And my uncle was considerably more wealthy than my parents were. And when I was 12, my uncle sent me with his son, that is to say my cousin, to Camp Ramah for the first time when I was 12 years old. And after a year or two in Ramah, it had a tremendous impact on me. And it was at approximately that time that I became interested both in the study of classical Jewish literature, the Bible, the Talmud, etc., and also decided that I probably wanted to be a rabbi. So then I said to my father that I needed someone to teach me the things that in the United Hebrew Schools they didn't emphasize as much. They taught a lot of Hebrew, and they taught some history, and they taught literature and things like that, but there wasn't such an emphasis on the classical literature. So my father knew from night school a Hungarian rabbi, and he made the shidduch with me, with this man, who became my private teacher from the time I was 12 till the time I was 22, and came to the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I studied with him all of the things that the United Hebrew School, his name is Rabbi Isaac Paneth, I studied Chumash and Mishnah and Gemara with him, and until I finished college and came to the rabbinical school in New York in 1962.
It's amazing. It's like you had a private melamed, and wouldn't it be nice if everybody had one?
It would be terrific. I still, to this day, his picture is in my wallet. I carry his picture around, and I have to tell you a wonderful story. You'll love this story. One day at the seminary, I was standing at the Xerox machine, and using the Xerox machine was Professor Shaul Lieberman. Shaul Lieberman was the greatest Talmudist in the world since the Gaon of Vilna. And something dropped out of his wallet when he was trying to take something in. So I picked it up and I handed it to him. He said to me, Roth, he said, do you know who this is? I said, no. He said, this is my Rebbe. This is Yaakov Nachum Epstein, who was my Rebbe. And so I took out of my wallet the picture of my Rebbe, and I said, Professor Lieberman, this is my Rebbe.
Today people have baseball cards. Once people had pictures of Rebbes in their life. But seriously, the academy, which is the basis for our school system is only about 200 years old. People didn't used to go to school. They had a sort of an apprenticeship if they were more able to afford it, or if they had more affinity to it. They learned more with privately, right? And you had both the academy and the melamed.
Exactly correct.
I think
exactly
that
correct.
when we're discussing how to revamp our Jewish education system, you should be the one who suggests a melamed works best.
In a certain sense, yes. I mean, that doesn't have to necessarily be a private melamed, but it should be sort of an accessible role model type of melamed.
So this you're hitting into why I started this whole program, because I usually wanted to call it Asel Chasav. I thought that the Zayde and the Bubis was the primal, sources of inspiration and role models. Of course, we don't have that anymore in today's world, our modern
There could
Jewish
be
world.
multiple types of role models. One thing that is little known at the seminary is that for a few years I was the director of the Melton Research Center for Jewish Education. And to tell you the truth, what the goal of the Melton Research Center has always been was not only how to transmit and teach Jewish sources, but how to do it in a way in which teachers serve as role models for students.
You're talking about your evolution as a child from the Ramah camp, being inspired and so on. How did you evolve your belief, your faith? Did you have conflict? Did you have revelation? Did you have high moments of epiphany?
Sure. Let me tell you a story or two which will embody what I'm talking about. One of the teachers that I had at Ramah when I was quite young was Professor Yochanan Mufs. I don't know whether you ever heard of Yochanan Mufs, but Yochanan Mufs, number one, was a phenomenal teacher and a Bible scholar, and he taught at JTS. Now, of course, at that time I was a kid. I wasn't at JTS. I was at home and in the Hebrew school system. It is from Yochanan Mufs that I first ever heard of the documentary hypothesis of the Torah. He was the Bible teacher, and he was teaching us in camp, and it's the first time I ever heard of J and E and P and D. I never had heard of it before Yochanan Mufs gave a class. And I had a very classical, I was 12, 13, 14 years old. I wasn't, in my 20s. But I had a very classical view of the nature of Torah. That is, I believed then absolutely in verbal revelation, and that every word in the Torah was literally dictated by God. And this view that Yochanan Mufs was transmitting with great vigor and fervor, I found exceptionally upsetting. So I went to Yochanan Mufs and I said, Yochanan, what you say to me presents a tremendous conflict, and I want you to tell me how you reconcile this. And you will be amazed at what he said. In all of the Ramah camps then and to this very day, whenever possible, some professor that teaches at JTS goes to camp as what is called a professor in residence. All right? And Yochanan, your Mufs said to me, Joel, I don't discuss that question. Go talk to the professor in residence. So I went to talk to several professors in residence over the years about that question. So that's the type of thing that inspired me. And because I found the scholarship of studies with Yochanan Mufs to be extremely persuasive and extremely convincing. But it was critical to me then and now that type of scholarship not undermine what I consider to be the essence of not only Jewish tradition, Jewish tradition as a whole, but even the ideology of the conservative movement to which I, as you well know, have dedicated my entire life, namely the authority of Jewish law.
Well, you know that I'll get back to this topic. We've discussed many
I never
times
get
before.
away from this topic.
But what's interesting about the Ramah story, first of all my kids went to Ramah, now my grandchildren go to Ramah, and as somebody said, it's not the yeshiva movement, but the camp movement that really affects future
That's absolutely
inspiration.
true. But 25 years I was a professor in residence in Ramah, Berkshires.
People came to you asking the same question?
Some did, by all means.
So I'll tell you, my first shock, I remember we used to visit for Shabbat, sometimes our children, so we stayed over, and I heard there's a shir. So I said, oh, there's a shir. I'm going, and I'm 2 minutes late, and I see it was some sort of shira or something, don't remember what it was, and I knew it more or less by heart. And I see that the order is wrong. So I'm waiting a minute, and I raise my hand, and I say, just a second, the order is wrong. He says, I know it's wrong, but that's how it should have been. That's how I understood that the conservative movement has a different idea about the text than I did. And I've been debating it. I'm going to the scholar in residence right now.
Okay. Welcome.
So I have you here with me. So what inspired you to follow the way to becoming a rabbi? Some people at the age of 12 want to be an astronaut, but they don't become one. You wanted to be a rabbi. What had prevailed in that?
So I will answer it in 1 second, but I do want to make it clear to you that I was not entirely abnormal. There was a period in my life when I wanted to be the third baseman for the Detroit Tigers. And there was a period in my life, this may sound abnormal to most people, that I wanted to be the concertmaster of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra because I used to take violin lessons and I was fairly good at the violin. So it wasn't that the only thing that I ever thought of being was a rabbi, all right? But more than anything else, it was the inspiration that I got and saw from all of these people that I was exposed to at camp. And all of them, in addition to being professors, were rabbis. And half of the staff, that may be a slight exaggeration, were either already students in the rabbinical school or were intending to be students in the rabbinical school. And all of that impressed me and persuaded me that this means so much to me that this is what I should devote my life to.
You're basically leading me to the next question, which is that landscape has changed tremendously. And what I want to ask you for the benefit of those who have not lived in the 1950s, which is when you were 12, when you grew up, Judaism looked different. The conservative movement, for instance, was flourishing. It was the high time.
No question.
It was a great wave of intellectual and rabbinic fervor. Can you take us to the Jewish life in your time and highlight what impressed you in particular?
Well, in addition to the people at camp, right? Knowing of the existence of people like Louis Finkelstein and Saul Lieberman and these professors of great reputation who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary and whose scholarship had changed the world of Jewish studies, that was the type of thing that impressed me so much. And I so much wanted to be part of that world. But I wanted that world to be transmitted to the people who belonged to conservative synagogues, right? So while the truth of the matter is, it's a very funny story too, I have never been a congregational rabbi. My goal always, even when I was in rabbinical school, was to be a congregational rabbi, to take a pulpit.
You're young.
Yeah, I'm a young 77-year-old. I can take a pulpit anytime now.
You know what? We wish all 77-year-olds to have the fervor and the energy you have.
Thank you.
And you go across the world each year. I follow you, and you inspire a lot of communities. So let's put it this way. Your pulpit is the world.
Well, yes, I don't want to take credit for having the whole world as my pulpit, but when I teach every year the seniors of rabbinical school in New York, and then I go to Yerushalayim for 6 or 7 months of the year, and I teach students of the West Coast Rabbinical School, and I go to Buenos Aires, to the Seminario in Buenos Aires, and I teach rabbinical students there. So my conviction is that I transmit, I at least attempt to transmit to them the message that I was trying to transmit, that I would always have tried to transmit to my congregants. And this way, I can impact many, many more in the conservative movement than I could have even if I had been a congregational rabbi.
It reminds me that one of the big rock stars, I don't know if it was Elvis or Cash or somebody, said that he always wanted to be a choir boy, but he failed. So he became a rock star.
Exactly.
So you didn't have a small pulpit, so you traveled the world.
Correct.
Can you tell us what was the demarcation line at your time, at that period, between the conservative movement and the modern orthodoxy, which was not exactly modern orthodoxy, but orthodoxy at the time?
Let me answer it from an ideological perspective, slightly oversimplified, but two things distinguish the ideological stance of the conservative movement then and even now from modern orthodoxy. And one was the willingness, not only willingness, but eagerness of conservative leaders to accept and adopt the findings of modern critical historical scholarship in all the disciplines of Jewish study, which included things like Tanakh and Talmud, and there were certain implications there that the modern Orthodox world rejected and rejects to this very day.
Let me focus about this, because that always troubled me. It's like faith is like love. It's an act of the heart. It's like, can you imagine that somebody says to their beloved, what attracted me to you is your analytical skill of text? Basically, that's what it is. And that's the shock that I have when I learn more about the conservative movement. It is more about analysis than about heartfelt.
Well, Sally, I have to tell you that that's because you didn't know these people personally.
No, there were lovers of Judaism. I know that. But there's more doctrine and ideology that I find in the JTS today than I find love and inspiration.
Okay, so first of all, I said that I was talking about of that period,
Right,
the period
right,
that you
right,
asked
right,
me about.
right,
all right?
right, right.
At
Okay.
some point, if you want
we'll
me to
get
talk
to
about
that.
what I think
We'll
where
get to
the
that.
movement was successful and where it hasn't been so successful, we can get to that. But in that day, okay, so as I give you as an example, the top of the pyramid in the Bible department in that era was Professor H.L. Ginsburg. We used to say about him that if Isaiah didn't say what H.L. Ginsburg said, Isaiah ought to have said what H.L. Ginsburg said, Isaiah ought to have said. On the other hand, when I used to sit in the seminary shul on Shabbos and watch H.L. Ginsburg walk down the aisle when he's entering the shul, mumbling the words of the davening like any other frum Jew, and sitting in near the front of the Beit Knesset and chuckling a little bit, and it was clear that he was davening with every ounce, every bit of the same ounce of fervor and dedication as any Orthodox Jew. It was clear to me and to my fellow classmates that there was no inherent contradiction between these two. The problem is that H.L. Ginsburg himself never said to us how he reconciled those two things. But it was clear to us that for him there was no contradiction.
Well, I'll ask you about the reconciling it later. But you're saying basically that a conservative at the time was a modern Orthodox with an open mind.
Yes. And I said there were two things, so I want to add the second one now. That is, its commitment to the authority of Jewish law went without question. But what distinguished it from modern Orthodoxy was its willingness to affirm that the sages of today have equal authority with the sages of the past.
I wish we heard more of that.
And that's what I think was, and in my opinion remains, the core of the ideology of the conservative movement.
An evolving halakhah, rather than a fixated halakhah.
An evolving halakhah, but it has to evolve within the parameters of the way that legal system works. The problem I have in our day is that there are too many conservative rabbis and scholars who are not at all concerned that the evolution take place within the parameters of legitimacy of the halachic system.
You know we'll get to that, right?
But yes, well, I suppose.
That's why you're not longer the dean.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, but okay. It may be why I'm now no longer the chairman of the law committee.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Okay.
That's why you're not longer the chairman.
Or even on the law committee.
Right.
I mean, I resigned from the law committee.
We'll get to that.
We can get to that if you want. And that was never the case in modern Orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And even to this day, when you have some modern Orthodox rabbis, I won't mention any names, but you know exactly who I mean, who are prepared to say a few radical things halachically, most of the rest of the modern Orthodox world excludes them from being modern Orthodox.
It's a funny line. I repeat it often when I remember Yitzhak Greenberg said that in the 60s I was on the right, in the 80s I was in the center, in 2000 I'm on the left, and I'll never change my views.
Well, I like Yitzhak Greenberg a lot, and I can say the following. When I wrote the paper that got women into the rabbinical school, nobody thought I was on the extreme right wing of the conservative movement. My Rabbi then said to me, Joel, you're associating with the left. And now, if you ask most conservative rabbis and most conservative Jews who've ever heard of me, who is the most right-wing conservative rabbi remaining in the conservative movement? The answer will be Joel Roth.
Yeah, this is funny.
And I haven't changed my views at all.
Yeah. Rabbi, some people see the conservative Judaism as Jewish light, but it is not for you. You're an observant Jew, you daven 3 times a day and follow Jewish laws of the Halakhah. How do you differentiate yourself? Well, I think we asked that question.
This, of course, I can say, and I will say, but I say it not with a smile, okay? The greatest failure of the conservative movement, in my opinion, has been its inability to create the constituency that both understands and lives by the ideology of the conservative movement. But that is an educational failure, not an ideological shortcoming. In other words, I still think that the ideology is correct, that we have not mastered how you go about transmitting it and convincing our laity to buy into that ideology and live according to that ideology. In that, we have not been so successful. And we pay the price for it. We pay a terrible price for it, I must tell you. And I hate to have to admit such things, okay? Yeah. But let me say 2 quick things. So some of the kids with whom we are most successful at Camp Ramah, when they go to college, end up davening in the Orthodox minyan. Why? Because there isn't a conservative minyan with people like them in terms of their behavior and their commitment and Shmirat Shabbat to whom to be friendly. The first 2 years of students who entered Chovevei Torah as a rabbinical school, a handful of them, there weren't so many in the first 2 years, came from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And the reason they were there was because we had begun the era in which the traditionalist wing of the conservative movement was beginning to feel uncomfortable in the conservative movement.
So I think there are 2 things that come to mind that I think are critical. You know, we can talk about theology and what should or shouldn't be, but we know that if we had today a Heschel, we would have droves of people join the conservative movement because people follow a Rabbi. If we had a Schneerson or Soloveitchik in the conservative movement rise to prominence who would inspire Jews, you will have tens of thousands of Jews attending the seminary because people follow brilliant, inspiring teachers. Maybe I'll let you deal with that.
So let me react to that. First of all, I think you're absolutely correct. There's no question. And one name
crisis of leadership.
One name you didn't mention was Mordechai Kaplan.
Kaplan,
right?
Of course.
Right. But remember this. Neither Mordechai Kaplan nor Heschel emphasized the extent to which Jewish law is mandatory and obligatory.
Because at the time people came from that. They didn't have to tell people that the sun is rising.
But Mordechai Kaplan said Jewish law should have a vote but not a veto. That is to say, he rejected the absolute authority of Jewish law. And that's precisely why he ultimately left the Jewish Theological Seminary. I came in 62. If I had been in Mordechai Kaplan's class then, he would probably have thrown me out because of the frumkeit of my theology at the time. And Heschel, yes, Heschel was brilliant. And the things that appealed to many, many people of Heschel, with that picture of him with Martin Luther King and all of that.
His poetry.
And his poetry, right? But you would be hard-pressed to find lectures of Heschel's in which what he's doing is emphasizing the authority of Halakhah.
Rabbi Dr. Roth, I don't care about lectures. I care about giving dollars on the stoop of your doorstep. I care about poetry. I care about walking in the marching in the street because, about demonstrating in front of the UN, about activism. That's what gets people involved. Then they learn about the lectures. Lectures have never attracted somebody besides scholars. So I'm looking at leadership, not intellectual leadership. I'm looking at leadership of appealing socially and heartfelt to be a strong Kol Bamidbar. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't come to prominence because he did the 10 Dibrot. It's because he hit the Mitzri, right? Yeah. That's the leadership I'm looking for, and that is what I don't see.
But remember that for a significant part of his career, Heschel was not the Heschel you're talking about.
Of course.
And in the student body, Heschel was not number one on the pyramid. And he didn't have tons of followers. He really did not. He became that later. Now,
so you still have hope?
Well, for me, it's probably too late. But there are young people who, they're not now that, but they have the potential for it. And that would be wonderful for the conservative movement. And I hope it would happen.
Let me point to the other thing that I think may have an effect, and I care about your opinion about this even intellectually or theologically. The Orthodox system has always put emphasis on what they call siyag leTorah, making fences. So we know that there was a debate whether electricity is like fire. They decided it's not, but just to be careful, they made it like a melacha, right? So they had fences upon fences upon fences. That created some sort of emphasis to be careful about how we cross
lines.
How we cross line. As you pointed out, the JTS crossed lines exponentially, like a brush fire. So I think we may have had a better wisdom in the Orthodox system, as Rabbi Golden likes to say, the art of unintended consequences, that because they were more careful to delineate right from wrong, halachically correct from halachically incorrect, even though they could have been more liberal, that had protected them.
In a certain sense, that's absolutely true. If I say that part of what distinguishes the conservative movement halachically from modern orthodoxy is its recognition that the authorities of its age have the same authority as the authorities of previous ages, and that even certain very radical steps, provided they can be defended within the parameters of legitimacy of the halachic system, can be taken. And in the modern Orthodox world, that is a very hard thing to do. Did it have as an unintended consequence that steps were taken within the conservative movement that probably should not have been taken, and that in fact undermined, in a certain sense, the critical nature of remaining within the confines of the halachic system when you do the evolution.
Or the community.
Or the community.
For instance, driving on Shabbos has
Exactly.
created no community.
You're absolutely right. And I must tell you, I think I can think of no tshuva ever approved by the conservative movement that was a worse responsum than that.
Yeah.
Okay? I think it's the worst one we've ever done.
It destroyed Jewish community.
On the other hand, but be fair, you remember when that was written. It was written when the process of suburbanization had just begun.
But also it was written. So here is my view of conservative evolution, and you correct me if I'm wrong. People came from Europe, they were frum, but they had to work on Shabbos.
Very often that's true.
Right, as your father
My
has
father,
done,
for
right?
example.
But they were not theologically discriminating. So the Orthodox said, you're wrong, and the conservative said, no problem. So they went to the conservative. But they lived in shtetl, like community. There was not an issue of suburbanization, and the conservative movement saw no issue with that. Subsequently, now, driving on Shabbos and working on Shabbos has really destroyed that communal core, because those people didn't do it ideologically. They did it just because it was...
pragmatically.
So I was just talking to Rabbi Luxstein a couple of months ago, and he said, look, see, the smart rabbis in the modern Orthodoxy didn't use the big fingers. They said, come whenever you can come. And that maintained the community.
I absolutely agree with you. One of the most resounding failures of the conservative movement was its inability to transmit its ideology to its laity and to get them to understand it and buy into it. And the result of it is that the number of conservative Jews who are Shomrei Mitzvot is very small.
Yeah.
And that is a very discouraging thing. I don't deny that. I cry over it. It isn't that there aren't a few shuls where the rabbi has been very successful at creating an observant Jewish community, but the number is very small, and I cry over that tremendously. Now, I always believed that the next generation of rabbis would find a solution to that problem. It hasn't happened, in my opinion, yet, and I am now very worried about it.
So maybe instead of teaching more about the nuance of Talmud, maybe you should go and make this your third trimester goal, to inspire leadership that sees giving the conservative movement more heart and flame.
Well, all you would ever have to do is ask my students of whether or not that message comes through in my classes that I teach in the rabbinical school, right? I try not to make that message so clear in the undergraduate classes that I teach, because there it's a much more academic, right? I'm not training them as rabbis, but I don't think you would find a rabbinical student who was ever in my class anywhere who would say to you that my message to that effect was not clear in class.
Right.
Rabbi, shows you what a striking success I've been about that.
Rabbi, I heard you say that what distinguishes the conservative path and the movement is its commitment to academic study of classic text. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, I thought that faith is a matter for the heart, not for the brain. In other words, academic text is more like the brain, while faith to me is more of something of love and falling in love and issue of the heart. So my question to you, isn't it like a backdoor way of inspiring faith? Analyzing text is not on my first list.
Okay, so let me react to that briefly. I do not believe that H.L. Ginsburg or Saul Lieberman or David Halivni or Robert Gordis intended, when they were teaching us their critical methodologies, to be utilizing those methodologies as an entrance into faith. I believe that they were appealing to our brains.
Right.
Okay? But that the heartfelt faith that you're talking about is a step different from these steps, from the scientific critical study steps. What they were trying to reflect to us was that there was no inherent contradiction between the two of them. But the problem is that all those great scholars almost never talk to us about how they reconciled the two in their lives. We saw that they did.
But I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about your statement of the present. I'm not talking about what Gordis or Lieberman or Finkelstein said. Today, I don't think that that's the strongest essence, or it shouldn't be. Today, the strongest essence of the conservative movement, it should be the heart first today.
But remember, what I said was that the commitment to this type of scholarship is the core of its ideology, of the ideology of the conservative movement. And the one thing I admitted already today, though, was that, in my opinion, the greatest educational failure of the conservative movement is that it has not made clear, either emotionally or intellectually, how I can believe what I do about the composition of the Bible or the method of editing of the Talmud, and yet remain committed to the divinity of Torah and the authority of Halakhah. So I admitted that we haven't succeeded at that. And that is a tremendous problem as far as I am concerned. Okay. Tremendous.
Here's the other flip question to that. You're talking about the analyzing classic text. Aren't the people studying Talmud all day doing the same? Why is not learning Talmud in a yeshiva not akin to analyzing classic text?
I didn't say they're not analyzing. I said analyzing in the school of thought of Western, sophisticated Western scholarship. You cannot read the Torah and ignore the fact that there are things in it that have parallels in the Code of Hammurabi. Sure. If you don't know that, there is something you are missing when you are studying Torah.
What are you missing? What are you missing?
You are missing the impact of the Code of Hammurabi on the Torah.
So I once heard a brilliant Dvar Torah that Saul Berman gave, and he said about somebody coming to him discovering that the Egyptians used talesem.
Or tzitzis, for sure.
Tzitzis, right? He says, wow, Jews didn't invent tzitzis. And Saul Berman said, doesn't bother me. It's that we used tzitzis for Torah and they didn't. The idea that the whole world uses...
Yes, that's true.
So the point is, the idea that Egyptians used tzitzis or Hammurabi had struggled with code of moral Torah. It is obvious evolution of mankind has dealt with legal systems, with worship systems. The question is really serious. Why do I need to know what the Greeks said about the Torah or what Hammurabi's evolution of code of law was when you think that God created the world, maybe?
I'll tell you why. Because your Orthodox friends who discover at age 60 that there is ancient Akkadian and Ugaritic influence on the Torah, and they discover that there are Greek and Latin words in the Talmud, and they discover that the editing process of the Gemara may not be that Ravina and Rav Ashi put the whole thing together as it is right now, and they discover those things, it may destroy their faith, because what they say is, my Rebbeim never told me that now you got to let me finish. That my Rebbeim never told me that the Jewish world was impacted upon by other elements of the world. Now, what you said, you're absolutely correct. What our Rebbeim have to do is to say, yes, there was impact of the Code of Hammurabi on Parshat Mishpatim. There's no question about it. But look at the difference of what the Jewish world, both then and now, has done with those things. That's what we haven't done to the extent that we have done it in order to make ourselves the success that I think we should be.
I agree with you. The only question, the only siag that I would put is that 60-year-old may not listen if he doesn't get inspired to begin with.
Okay, so I'm not saying that you have to tell him about the Code of Hammurabi when he's 6 or when he's 12.
But when you go to the JTS, so I'll tell you something that really blew me away. I went to JTS many times. It's a great source of intellectual and cultural events. So I heard that there was this series about Jewish history, a 2-year series, and I sit in classes with your students and people who didn't really work, the students' body, the people who came were older and they didn't really have great Jewish background. They wanted to understand the Torah. What I was in shock to the extent that the documentary hypothesis dogma was used at every second sentence. And I was in shock. Like, when you're talking about Noah or about Cain and Hevel or about this, there's always a disclaimer. But by the way, this wasn't real. We find later that it was actually made up. And I thought to myself, why is this dogma so prevalent? Because according to that, people will not get to age 60 still asking questions. They would say, you know what?
Look, if I were to read ancient science books,
Right.
okay, in which it would become clear to me from reading them that the earth is square. And I had a teacher who was teaching me those books.
Yeah.
And never made the point that we now know that the earth is not square. I would be very upset because that teacher would be failing in his mission. On the other hand, the teacher would also be failing in his mission if he didn't say to me, but the people who wrote those books were working within a system that they thought was accurate. We have much to learn from them, even if the factualness of the squareness of the earth is not accurate.
Okay. All right, let's go to broader questions.
Okay.
Okay. We'll take it temperature down. What do you see as the greatest challenges facing the Jewish people today? Please.
The Jewish people as a whole, you mean? Well, okay, I will tell you, I am very concerned about the rate of intermarriage, which I think could have devastating consequences for the Jewish people as a whole. And I am also, this is more recent, and I hope it will not last forever and ever, very concerned with what appears to be a modification of the attitude, both of the rest of the world, but of Jews too, to the state of Israel.
So one is political.
The latter is political, right? And the former
the first one is assimilation.
Assimilation.
So in regard to assimilation, basically it comes from a simple problem that they like us now. So when they didn't like us, we couldn't assimilate. Now they like us.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? How do you balance the need to live in a world where the rules have changed and they like us, or they accept us, in America at least, while keeping Judaism still vibrant and unchanged?
Well, but that's what we've been hinting at all along. That is, that I think we have to find a way to persuade the Jewish world that my being Jewish is not because it's being imposed on me by non-Jews who hate me and who put me in a separate category, but I want to be liked and be a participant in society, but I am Jewish because of the positive values that I personally and communally find in being Jewish. So what I want to do is find a way to have that impact, but I don't want to have to get out of the modern world in order to do it. So I'm not saying it's easy.
You can say that the more religious, or I wouldn't even say Haredim, but the more religious aspect, the modern Orthodox with less modern, more Orthodox, have basically succeeded because they have narrowed the modern bleeding. They narrowed the modern universe. So in a sense, the dilution, the attraction
Yes.
of all the other noises around us
It's less.
is less, and therefore the child today, they have all the channels, all the portholes to the grand modern world.
You're
So
absolutely
in a
right.
sense, you can say that the Orthodox world, while we ridicule them about how many fences they do to Torah, they are succeeding to keep the children more within the Torah world.
There's no question that that is true. By the way, I don't think anything I've said in our talk today ridiculed them for that. I mean,
Other people do.
Others may. I do not ridicule anybody for that. Now, look, Sally, if I had the simple answer to this question, I would have given it years ago. I don't have the simple answer to this question, but I do know that that's the direction in which I would like to be able to go.
How do you see the effect of the Holocaust on all that we discussed? I'll tell you why I mentioned. I just saw a certain movie that is common now, One of Us. But there was a line about the Hasidic movement, and that line was saying, because of the Holocaust, the community is looking as the children as belonging to the community. The mission of the community is to replace or replenish the loss that we had from the Holocaust. And if we are not careful, just like we lost those, we'll lose now. There is a certain trauma that is getting reshaped in affecting us in other venues.
This would be a better question to ask somebody who was more sociologically oriented than I, but my initial reaction to this issue is that the impact of the Holocaust is getting less and less and less on the Jewish people with every passing year, except for the resurgence of anti-Semitism recently in Europe. By and large, Jews are focusing less now, it seems to me, on the Holocaust, except in the most frum of circles.
That's what I'm talking about.
Except
the mythology continue.
Exactly. But the problem, in quotation marks, the problem with that mythology is that they live a life of isolation.
By choice.
By choice.
No,
but that life of isolation is then imposed on their children. Okay, that's why you have a movie that talks about those who break out of the Hasidic out of the Haredi world and what the Haredi world does in reaction to them and things like that. But the impact of the Holocaust on the rest of the Jewish world is getting, I think, less and less and less, and I regret that tremendously. Though I don't want that it be only because of the Holocaust that the Jewish world perceives itself as compelled to survive and thrive.
Yeah, well, it has worked for 50 years.
I don't deny that.
Yeah, okay.
But okay.
Okay, I would remiss if I didn't ask you a few questions about the conservative movement in which you have played a leadership role for more than a generation.
Okay, go ahead.
I understand that there's no belief in the giving of Torah in Sinai, in the oral law, or in Revelation. Can you elaborate on these and what other omissions or changes has the conservative Judaism drawn out from the canon of Judaism and why?
So let me say that while there is a huge theological spectrum within the conservative movement, and that there is no way I can react to all elements on that spectrum, right? I think it is not correct that most conservative Jewish theologians think there was no revelation at Sinai. Most would affirm that there was a revelation at Sinai. The question is, what was that revelation? Was it God speaking words? Was it an I-thou encounter between the entire people and the Spirit of God? Was it a type of spirituality? But very few, I'm not saying none, but few of the theologians of the conservative movement deny that there was some event at Sinai. Okay, some may argue about whether it was literally at Sinai or some other whatever. I don't want to argue about that.
Also, people didn't want to listen to it anyway. They asked Moshe to.
Well, that's what the Torah says. Right. Yes, correct. Okay, so now
We're going by the Torah, by the way.
I understood that. So don't immediately dismiss everybody in the conservative movement as rejecting that there was a revelation.
Okay, revelation we discussed.
But the most wish to affirm that the nature of that revelation is not one that denies that the Torah was composed in the spirit of that revelation over centuries following that. Okay, and that it was not verbally dictated.
Well, so that creates huge problems, as you know.
It potentially creates huge problems, and it potentially creates wonderful accommodation of my intellectual rigor with my spiritual and religious faith.
Well, we all see the intellectual rigor and the spiritual faith. Let's talk about the problems. So one thing that I understand is we discussed how the conservative movement has a challenge when it comes to divinity. So why is the principle of
divinity of Torah, you mean?
The Torah, yeah. So why is the principle of a non-divine Torah so central to conservative movement? Isn't it more of I claim than I believe?
No. I think that the claim of most of the conservative movement is that the Torah is divine, but not in the sense that most of the Orthodox Jewish world means by that.
It's like saying, I love my Zayde, but don't listen to what he says.
No, they do not say.
But if it's divine by inspiration, but not divine by every letter or every word, we have a problem with all of our halachic codes.
Why do we? We don't
I'll tell you why. Okay, you're an expert on Halakhah. We learn from Kutzo Shel Yod. We learn from a letter or from an absence of a letter.
Sally.
So, let me form the question.
Okay.
We learn about why it's okay to do this and not to do that because of the repetition or the omission of one letter or one word in a text.
Correct.
If the Torah was written by Baruch, which is it's not just any Baruch, it's Yirmiyahu's Baruch.
No, I don't know about that, but okay.
Or redacted by... Okay. Then bottom line is that maybe he didn't sleep enough that day and he forgot Yud.
I give you a two-part answer. Here's part number one. Read decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States, which deduces laws by reading the words of the Constitution and saying, why is it that in Article X, whatever, it says null and void?
Because they're not divine, but they're not divine.
Stop. Now it's my turn. The Constitution says null and void for a purpose. And we, the Supreme Court, are now going to interpret what that purpose was. That's the same type of Midrash Halakhah that you're talking about. And nobody claims that the Constitution was given literally by God. I now go a step way beyond that. And I say to you, when I say that the Torah is divine, I didn't use the word inspiration. You used the word inspiration. What I am affirming, this is my personal theology, what I am affirming is that the composition of the Torah in the form that it is an act of divine providence. Those who composed it may not have known they were acting as God's agents.
Well, we're getting now to your paper.
1 second. If I had the cutting floor of the redactor who had J and E and P, and he took this from P and this from J and this from E and put it together in a certain way, there are all those things on the cutting floor that he didn't take, and he could have put this together in a very different way, but he put it together dafka in this way, and I'm contending
God moved his hand.
That exactly right. I don't mean literally moved his hand, but what I mean is that was an absolute act of divine providence. And therefore, though I think the evidence of J and E and P and D is overwhelming, the divinity of Torah is precisely because it's providential, and that's why I have no problem with all this Midrash Halakhah that you're talking about.
Good. So I read your paper, Musing Towards a Personal Theology of Revelation.
Yes, which I wrote for Neil Gilman. Yes.
And we discussed your approach towards finding divinity within a Torah composed by men. But still, on a simple level, how do you reconcile the idea that it's a little hard to say that God has known already what we're going to do and He's controlled all that we did. So there's a problem with it, because in fact your argument is so ever encompassing that it could be used to explain or justify just about everything. Whatever we do, God already anticipated, and thus He controls it and uses it towards His goal.
That's why I never carry it the distance that you carry it. All right, because
that's my job.
No, but I'm not saying that my theory eliminates the issue of free choice.
Well,
right? That's what you're saying.
So the redactor didn't have free choice.
I didn't say that that's. I'm not so sure that that's true. Providence does not necessarily mean that I didn't have a choice. Providence means. You know that my field is not theology, but I'll do.
For non-theological, you're very good at it.
Thank you, but it's not really. It is not really my field. But here's what I would react and respond to what it is you're saying now. God's providence is the result of God's living outside of time.
Right.
For God, there's no present, past, and future. For human beings, there can be nothing but present, past, or future. Providence means that God sees, because He sees all of time as present. He sees what people chose, but they had the freedom to choose as they wished. But God, without stopping them from choosing what they wished, knew in advance what the choice was going to be, not because He made it, but because God sees all of eternity in one time.
And He chooses when to intervene or not.
Yes, if He intervenes, that's a miracle.
Well, but I'm saying with the redactors, then He intervened.
I don't know if He intervenes. Or
He moved those pieces in the order, so he
or
either she's pregnant or not pregnant. Intervened or not.
Or saw at the moment of revelation at Sinai, or at the moment of creation of Adam, right? That this is the way it was going to end up, and that's what God all along intended to be the Torah.
Well, that's
it ain't an easy theology to transmit, I concede.
But I'm just hope that people can understand the complexity without being undermining it. I think it's a very interesting
absolutely
challenge.
Right. I think you are absolutely right.
And I don't think that this is something that you decide. I think it's something that you live. You live with it.
And it's an act of faith.
And you see how it affects you over time.
I absolutely agree with you.
I like that.
I absolutely
obviously, the problem that we have is when God already knows the outcome, why doesn't He stop us from hurting ourselves or other people?
Because otherwise they're animals, not humans.
Yeah, but we want to educate our children not to touch the oven. So we let him touch it with his finger and he finds it's hot and he learns that. But we don't educate them to learn about not crossing the street and letting them get hit by a bus.
Well, that's absolutely true.
So the question is, how do you deal with pain? And here it goes to an emotional point. If God is Avinu,
Shabbat
Shamayim, how can He allow pain? I cry not about the 6 million. I cry about each person.
Look.
How do you live with that as a rabbi?
You know that theologians have struggled with the problem of evil forever.
I'm asking you,
and none of them has a solution.
I'm not talking about
to
evil.
It.
I'm talking about pain.
Well, that's part of the problem.
That's the other side.
Well, why does an all-good God, right, allow this one to get cancer and that one to be in pain and this one's appendix to break and he dies?
Right. Is that what you would do if you were God? People broke their faith because of the Holocaust. People broke their faith because they lost a loved one.
Yes,
we deal with that. And I'm asking you how you deal with that.
So I'll answer that question specifically in 1 second. But what I'm saying is, the first thing we should know is that every generation has asked that question.
We know that.
And no generation has found the perfect answer to that question.
I'm asking you for an imperfect answer.
I understand. I understand. So my imperfect answer to that question is a type of belief that all of those things that I cannot understand why God would have allowed, in the eternity of humanity, there has to have been a positive reason. That doesn't mean that I know that reason or will ever know that reason. But that is my only answer to that question. Does that answer satisfy me when I'm sitting around and wondering why my grandpa had his leg amputated because he was a diabetic? No, the answer is it doesn't. But if you ask me on some abstract plane, do I think that God's eternity views all of this in a way very different from what any human can? The answer is yes.
Okay, so how do you deal with those big questions about Mashiach, about Olam Haba, about Gan Eden? What's your picture of it?
Well, let's put it this way. As a matter of faith, I actually believe in Olam Haba. I believe in Biat HaMashiach. I wish you would hurry up, but I cannot prove it.
I'm asking
In
how do you feel about it?
I feel that those will be the ways in which some of the things that bother me so much, like evil and suffering in this world, right, will be righted because of the world, in the world to come, right? Or that people who, in my opinion, in this world look like they're doing horrendous things with great success. I believe that in some ultimate world there will be justice and right and righteousness. So the world to come does that for me.
Yeah.
Okay? And Biat HaMashiach is no more and no less than the reflection of my human desire to see the world perfected.
Well, I have a radical question for you.
Okay.
If this wasn't radical enough.
As if none of these others were radical enough. Yeah, but okay.
So what the last parsha was Halakhah, and
Indeed
God
it was,
promises that Avram will be, and this is the plan B for God, right? The plan B, plan A, he destroyed, right?
Okay.
So Avram, God learned from his, we assume, we're using
human terms,
human
his
terms,
mistake.
right?
God learned from his mistake.
And his key is that he says it, Asecha legoy gadol, we're going to make you to a tool, a vessel, a vehicle to change the world. Am I putting it correct words?
Pretty well, yeah.
Okay. One can argue that our job is done. Look at our world, how it has changed in the last 3,000 years. You know, we used to have no law regarding property, regarding sanctity of people, regarding civil rights, regarding anything. The king could come and take your property because he thought so. He could take your wife. He could take your life. We can go and conquer the next door city, and there would be nothing wrong. Now we have code of law. It's not perfect. We have a lot of imperfections, but the trajectory of humanity, you can say, has been on a course of an improvement and evolution.
Yes.
So here's my question. You can say that maybe the world is not perfect yet, but we crossed the line of no return. And you can say that the system now is self-correcting. Maybe according to that, there is a moment, a theory, or an idea, or we cannot discard it, like we haven't discarded a lot of other radical ideas, that our job is done. At some point, if our job is done, it doesn't have to be messianic.
Well, so it's only because of the last sentence that I understand where you're coming from. But my reaction until your last sentence would have been, you may be right about the trajectory, but half of the world is still the way you described.
But it's
Right.
half of the world that wasn't, the other half of the world was not where it is.
No, that's true.
So maybe
I'm not,
it is.
absolutely. The trajectory, we can look at the trajectory of the world positively.
Right, so
Okay.
maybe the job was...
But we're only halfway done.
But when you're raising a child, you're only a third way or quarter of the way down when he moves out of the house.
And you don't think you're done then either. He
But
may
it's-
move out of the house, but you don't say, I'm now putter.
No, but
you keep track of your children till you die.
Track and command are two separate things. We don't say that God is now.
But track and influence are not necessarily two different things.
So let's put it this way. A captain of a ship is in charge of the ship until he gets to the port. People get off the port and they...
But the port is Mashiach Zeit, and we're not there yet.
Well, that's the question. Maybe we don't know what God had in mind.
But that's what that was my answer to your previous question.
Yeah.
That's what I think the Mashiach is.
What is your view of Tikkun olam? Of the correction of the world?
I'm not sure what you mean by the question. Do I think that is a goal of ours? The answer is of course. Do I think it is our only goal? The answer is no. Because if Tikkun olam were my only goal...
No, what does Tikkun olam mean to you in
the improvement of humanity?
Yeah, or how do you think it works from the Jewish perspective? What is your obligation? What is our obligation in Tikkun olam?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. Our obligation is to do whatever we can do to improve the world. That's what Tikkun olam means.
In what way?
It means in all the ways you were talking about before, that society is just, that, the government can't come and steal my house. Okay. On the other hand, the government, it is part of Tikkun olam that if I evade paying income tax for 5 years, that the government can do something so that I recognize that I'm undermining Tikkun olam by not paying my income tax.
I would think that you would say something, because I heard you say that, conducting yourself properly in business and behaving like a mensch and being a role model.
Yes. All of those things are included in it. What I'm worried about is that people will understand you and they might understand me as implying that the essence of my humanity is Tikkun olam, working toward Tikkun olam. And therefore, it doesn't really matter whether I wear a shirt that's made of wool and linen. And it doesn't really matter whether I melt a piece of cheese on a hamburger. And I don't want that conclusion to be drawn. I don't want to minimize Tikkun olam, but I don't want Tikkun olam to outweigh all the other things that I think are the will of God for me.
So if there was a press conference, I think we'd come out and we'll agree that we agree on Tikkun olam as dictated by Torah.
Yes, and that not all the dictates of Torah are Tikkun olam.
You are such a linguist. Anyway, let's go back to the tough part. Why study the documentary hypothesis instead of the Talmud? They ask the same hard questions. It's just the documentary hypothesis is ideologically committed to a non-divine Torah.
No. Nobody who teaches Gemara would ever tell Gemara students don't study Chumash.
But Gemara is questions on the Chumash. It's not challenging the Chumash. I mean, it is challenging the Chumash to come with answers that are from within the Chumash system.
But when I teach, even in a yeshiva, and I teach Chumash, but I don't want to study Chumash with less intellectual integrity than I study Shakespeare.
Let's go back to asking the same question differently. We will not debate the documentary hypothesis here. Let's agree on that. But as we discussed it before, how can we disprove the divinity of Torah when the Torah doesn't pretend to be a history book or an accurate account of what happened? After all, the doublets and different names and Mukdam and Mu'achar are not enough, and there's no archaeological basis for any of it. So how can you disprove something that doesn't claim factual accuracy?
No, let me say one thing. You keep phrasing this as to disprove the divinity of Torah.
Not even the divinity, even the mechanics of the Torah.
But what I'm claiming is that even those mechanics are part of the divine providence. So I'm not undermining the divinity of Torah at all.
Is that what the people who believe in the documentary hypothesis claim?
most of them don't talk about theology because that's not their field.
They're saying it has been.
They're saying
another.
to us there seems to be internally persuasive evidence by the use of language, by what looks like apparent contradictions, by the fact that the book of Leviticus seems to have a whole set of different interests than Shemot or Dvarim, right? It looks to us in our sophisticated Western way of looking at world literature that this is evidence that there is more than one author who wrote these words.
Or maybe more than one emphasis. Let's put it this way.
Maybe.
A parent,
Maybe.
a parent once talks to a child firmly, and one talks lovingly, and one spanks him.
Correct.
And each time uses different methodology.
But
if we look 2,000 years later on the record, they will say there were 3 people.
But one parent doesn't say to him, you have to eat matzah 7 days, and another one say you have to eat it 6.
Maybe sometimes there was less matzah.
But there's no way to read that into those 2 psukim.
Okay.
So all I'm trying to say is that from the perspective of the Bible scholar, right, he or she sees what seems to be overwhelming evidence there can be multiple human beings who wrote down the words. But that doesn't mean they deny its divinity.
Okay, last question on this. We think that there's a redactor, okay? Now, this redactor tried to make a seamless, more or less document, right?
I'm not so sure whether he intended it to be seamless.
Well, do you think that a redactor would not have corrected the doublets or corrected the inconsistencies?
It would depend what the redactor's goal was, and to the extent that all of this is an act of divine providence, then my belief is that by that divine providence, that wasn't the goal of the redactor, because had he done that, the Torah could not have been the viable source for the ongoing evolution of Jewish tradition from that day till this.
Good. We talked now about a lot of different things, but your magnum opus is your book about the halachic process. Can you describe it to us, and what is it?
Yes, I will try to do that with brevity. The full title of that book is The Halachic Process, a Systemic Analysis. That is to say, many people, when they see the title of my book, mispronounce it, and they say a systematic analysis. Systematic would mean that I'm doing it systematically. A systemic analysis means a description of how the system works as a system.
The halachic system.
The halachic system. The halachic system, a systemic analysis, means to describe the system that is the way that legal system works, okay? And what it tries to do is go from step 1, let's say, which posits, I didn't write that theologically, but in terms of what we're discussing now, step 1, which posits the divinity of Torah as a given for the systemic functioning of the halachic process. If it isn't divine,
then we have
the system collapses. Not every legal system would collapse if it wasn't divine. The American legal system didn't collapse, and nobody claimed the Constitution is divine.
Now we have a divine president.
That's a different question. But so starting with step 1 of the divinity of Torah as the premise, which then follows from, does everything have the authority of the divinity of Torah? Or does the system recognize that some things have the authority not literally of the Torah, but of the sages who understood the Torah the way they understood it? And can we define with certainty which of those understandings of the sages they would define as having the authority of Torah, as opposed to those which have the authority of the sages, but not literally the authority of the Torah?
Let me ask you if I understand you correctly. Your halachic process book, and I'm using the title, is basically decoding the people who have created our halachic laws. How did they come up with those laws as derived from the Torah?
what laws did they come up with?
And how?
How? And do they claim that they were all from the Torah, or
Okay.
do they say that some of them are from themselves?
Okay, so do you exclude Torah Sheba'al Peh from this process?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so you, Rabbi Dr. Joel Roth, believe in the Torah Sheba'al Peh as a tool or as a having viable...
I believe in the Torah Sheba'al Peh as the backbone of the halachic system.
But not everybody believes in it in the conservative movement.
I suppose that's true.
Most people I heard in JTS say the oral law is puzzle.
Before we started filming all of this, we were mentioning some books. I will not mention any books now, but we mentioned some books of people who are analyzing certain things. And I said, from a scholarly point of view, they may be analyzing very accurately, but I think the danger of what they're doing is that it undermines the halachic system.
How can anybody say there's no oral law? Oral law is basically...
I don't really know anybody in the conservative movement who says there's no oral law.
Well,
they may not say it's binding on them,
okay,
but they don't. But I mean, even Mordechai Kaplan said, if I find what more oral law says to be meaningful and add significance to my life, I do it.
Oral law is basically the cultural evolution of our system by people
true.
who had the divine knowledge over the years, over centuries, over millennia.
I'm not sure what you meant by divine knowledge, but yes, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. When the Chassam Sofer wrote a tshuva saying that women should be taught Torah, even though that can be against what the Gemara says, and he justified it halachically, that's part of what we're talking about. Absolutely right.
Another big part of your book and your belief, and I think that's the core thing that I take from it, is that you believe that the Halakhah is a dynamic, open-ended legal system.
Absolutely correct.
That still survives and should be evolving today.
I absolutely agree with you. That is exactly what I think.
In line of that, we have those different sources of codes of authority. We have
the Rambam.
Oh, okay. We have Doraita, we have Rabbanan, and Minhag Israel.
Yes, okay.
So just to put them in theological terms, we have the Torah, the divine Torah, we have the rabbis, and then we have customs, right?
Yes.
And by the way, we say customs override the rabbis.
Minhag Mevatel Halakhah. We could write a whole book about that. But okay. I have a whole chapter on Minhag, by the way.
Right. Now, it seems today that we have a lot of rabbis, but they are not believing in their ability to affect halacha anymore. Even though that over the years they did. Rabbi Gershom did, and Rab Tam did, and others.
You mean now rabbis whom the world calls Orthodox.
Right.
You're absolutely right.
So there is now a rule, because we don't have a Sanhedrin, rabbis cannot make a binding halachic law.
In a certain sense, Sally, that is my claim of why the conservative movement is more authentic than orthodoxy. Okay. Let me add only one PS. When I show to Orthodox people tshuvot of Gedolim that do the very things that you're talking about, I don't mean say we can't change the law, but change the law. And I say, he did it.
Right.
They say, but he's a godel. And it's what I think makes the conservative movement halachically more authentic than orthodoxy. The problem is I don't have a laity.
So here's the point. We are now in a crisis, different, but of magnitude, not different than after the Chorban Bet HaMikdash. I'll tell you how I look at it. Our Jewish practice was temple-based. We didn't have siddur, we didn't have 3 times a day davening, we didn't have all of the code of Jewish practice, because we had a temple-based practice.
Okay, but we managed to overcome that even in the Talmudic period.
No, it is the overcoming I'm talking about, the courage that rabbis took during the Talmudic and pre-Talmudic period to change that practice, there was no Sanhedrin anymore, and they have basically reshaped Judaism for millennia.
Indeed, they have.
Now we are the people of the book who don't have a book anymore. We have 144 tweet words, and we don't read books, we don't write books, we are now texting. I would say that in terms of Jewish practice, we don't have the book. It's like we didn't have the temple, we changed our practice, we don't have the book anymore, we have to change our practice. Why don't we realize that we have the same authority and the same challenge and the same existential needs, just like the rabbinic period had in doing what they did then?
Well, you know that I think that ideologically the conservative movement thinks precisely what you just said. Right? The only problem is when it tries to do some of those things, it doesn't have a constituency that has bought into its ideology.
I allow you to use my example, by the way.
Okay.
So I'll go to some of the more important personal impact that you have.
Okay.
As a chairman of the Committee of Jewish Law for many years, you have decided a lot of positions of the entire movement, or you helped shape them, rather.
Yeah.
As part of this role, you are well known for supporting the ordination of women as rabbis, which this was in 1983, I think, right?
The first one, yes.
Can you elaborate on the role of women in today's Jewish world and what makes it so relevant?
Well, first of all, I want to correct one technical thing. That paper, that tshuva, I wrote for the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary, not for the law committee.
But they ultimately used it later on.
The faculty used it. The faculty used it to admit women to the rabbinical school. Okay? And then the law committee sort of adopted it as a position that it would say okay to. But it wasn't written for the law committee. Okay. It was written for the faculty of the seminary. Now, what the goal of that paper was to say there is a way within the halachic system, in my opinion, to allow women to do most of the things that are required of people who serve as rabbis. That meant, I said, in my opinion, there is a way to allow women who wish to renounce their exemption from certain obligations like daily prayer, and obligate themselves to be bound by the requirement for daily prayer.
That's the only thing that you did?
Wait. That those women, I tried to prove, I'm not going to tell you how, it took 5 pages of footnotes and everything to do it, those women's halachic status is equal to the halachic status of men in daily prayer. And since a minyan is a quorum of the equally obligated, those women can count to the minyan.
Okay.
That's what I said, because I said it would seem not so great for a woman to become a rabbi and not be able to lead her community in prayer, not be able to be part of the minyan. I went one step further and I said, to be a role model for the conservative Jewish community, I think a woman who wants to be a rabbi has to obligate herself for all the mitzvot from which a woman is exempt.
Well, once she does that, then she is considered a man for all practical purposes?
She's considered having equal rights with men for all things. The one issue was serving as a witness. Serving as a witness is, using the terms we were talking before, an issur d'oraita. It is a prohibition with biblical status. It's not that there's a pasuk that says women can't be witnesses. It's that Chazal deduced by Gzera Shava that women cannot be witnesses. But Gzera Shava has the status of d'oraita. I said to the faculty, I beg of, I didn't say it quite this bluntly, but I beg of Lieberman and Dimitrovsky and Finkelstein and Halivni to say, this is the case where we have the right, which I demonstrate in chapter 7 of my book, la'akor davar min haTorah b'kum v'aseh. We have the right even to
amend
something that is d'oraita. But this is d'oraita because of a rabbinic understanding of the Gezerah Shava. They refuse to do that. They wouldn't do that.
The faculty.
The elders of the faculty.
Right.
I, to this day, will not allow a woman to serve as a witness. Because even though I think we have the right to do that, I am not prepared to do that because that will affect Klal Yisrael in ways that are not worth my living by my principle for, because too many people's lives will get affected. So I don't do it. That's what my goal was in the ordination of women.
So we went heavy legalistic here, but my question is, how do you see the role of women today in Jewish world? And I'll tell you where it comes to me from. Many of our laws come from the social status of women in our life, which has changed. Now it used to be...
I am looking one at a time for halachic ways to equalize that status. That's what I would like to do, but I will not do it outside of the halachic system.
And how do you see the argument, the discourse that is happening in the Jewish community around it? Is it hurting the Jewish community?
I think it's too early to tell whether it's hurting the Jewish community, but it is certainly making clear what are the distinctions between different segments of the Orthodox world.
Absolutely.
Right.
Now, however, and most controversially, is the way I understand it, you're the author of a responsa excluding homosexuals from ordination.
So I'm going to stop you to correct you right there. My paper, yes, it was being discussed when the question of ordination of homosexuals was the subject on the agenda.
Right.
Okay? But my paper was not about their ordination. My paper was about, is there halachic permission of any kind for males to engage in sexual behavior with males or females to engage in sexual behavior with females?
Okay.
And my conclusion was that as much as I would love to be able to find halachic permission, because I know that saying no affects the lives of people and hurts them tremendously, I cannot find that halachic permission in a way that I think is halachically defensible. Therefore, it seems to me that by divine law, a homosexual can have the attractions that a homosexual has or whatever, but may not act upon them. And my paper says a homosexual who is celibate, I have no problem with that person being a rabbi.
That's a loaded way, because we know for many centuries people try to claim celibacy with all kind of horrible stories.
Yes, but I'm not prepared to give permission for the behavior.
Okay. So on December 2006, you resigned from the committee on Jewish law after they accepted ordination of active homosexuals as rabbis.
Correct.
While at the same time they adapted and they
with the same number of votes. My paper that said no.
Say no. So how it sounds too complicated. Can you shed some light? How can they accept your paper and still ordain those people?
Because the way the law committee, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards works is that any paper which gets 6 votes of the members of the law committee is considered a validated position for the conservative movement. So you can have, the same way as Beit Hillel says this is kosher and Beit Shammai says it's treif, but both of those positions exist in the Mishnah, right? And for 200 years, some did it this way and some did it this way. We have the same thing. So when it came to a vote there, 13 members of the law committee voted in favor of the Dorff, Nevins, and Reisner paper, and 13 members of the committee voted in favor of my paper. Now, the only problem is, the technical problem, is there are only 25 voting members. And 13 and 13 still is 26. That's an absolutely scientific fact, okay? One member of the law committee voted in favor of both papers. Because what that member said, to me it seems that Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These are both defensible substantive halachic arguments, so I vote in favor of both of those papers. You would be hard-pressed to find, this is very upsetting, you understand, you would be hard-pressed to find, today, to find conservative rabbis, conservative rabbinical students, or conservative Jews who are even aware that there is still a paper valid in the conservative movement that says that type of behavior is forbidden.
Okay, so we covered that. The last halachic issue that I want to bring up is the case of matrilinear and patrilinear descent, which I know you feel strongly about, and the effect, in essence, of the question, who is a Jew, and can you elaborate on that?
Yes, with brevity. The Bible is clearly patrilineal.
Right.
The Bible is clearly patrilineal.
Meaning that
That Joseph's kids are Jews, and the Bible doesn't know a thing about conversion. Okay?
Joseph married the Egyptian woman.
Indeed, he did. In that case, for his kids to be considered Jewish, it has to be that it's patrilineal. There's no question. There's big argument about when did we switch to matrilineal, but there is no question that the entire rabbinic period is matrilineal, and there's only been one
patrilinear. Oh, rabbinic.
Rabbinic period.
Yes.
From the Mishnah on, it's clear. It may have started as long ago as Ezra. I actually suspect that it did, but if it didn't, it started shortly after Ezra, that we are matrilineal. There are 16 different views, that's an exaggeration, of why we switched to matrilineality, and those are hard to prove one way or the other, but it is clear that there is, with only one exception in the Yerushalmi, every posek has affirmed matrilineal descent since the days of the Mishnah. So the weight of precedent is all in favor of matrilineal descent. That's step one. Step two. People who are talking about patrilineal descent are not talking about patrilineal descent. They're talking about either or. If your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. If your father is Jewish, you're Jewish. There is no precedent in all of Jewish history for such a view.
Well,
no precedent.
But actually, I'll tell you, because logic says if one day A is correct and one day B is correct, so in a sense, right. A and both are correct?
No. But first of all,
why not?
Because the rabbinic tradition supersedes the pshat of the Chumash.
But nobody said that it's either or.
Yes, everybody said it's either the mother or the father. It can't be both.
Why? Tell me why.
Why, for the moment, doesn't matter. So that has been the uncontested view since the period of the rabbis.
Right.
So I point out the following things. Number one, the weight of precedent is clear. This is not a matter of Jewish legal dispute any time since the Mishnah.
Right.
That's number two. Number three, the people who are talking about it are not talking about patrilineal descent. They're talking about whether it's the father or the mother, either one is sufficient to make the kid Jewish. The most important thing to me is that the impact this will have on the unity of the Jewish people is enormous. And I have to be as worried about Klal Yisrael as I am about my own people.
So in other words, let's say if your neighbor, the mother is not Jewish, but they go by some authority that they're Jewish, down the line, your grandchild can marry their grandchild, grandson, granddaughter, or whatever, and one of them is not going to be Jewish. So in your...
My grandchild cannot marry their grandchild.
But it will, if it happens...
that's what will happen. And do you know what it's going to result in? No. I'll tell you what it's going to result in. It's going to result in the same thing that's separated between Jews and Christians. We think Jews and Christians stop talking to each other because of theology. I don't believe that's true. I'll tell you what it is. All of Jesus' early disciples said, if you want to be Christian, you must become first Jewish. Paul went out to the Goyim and said, you can become Christian without becoming Jewish.
He won.
For a few generations, Jews could trace. Your daughter says she's Christian. So I now trace. Her mother was Jewish. Okay, my son can marry your daughter. Okay? Come 3 generations or 4 generations, you can't trace it anymore. So the Jewish world had to decide, either we give up and we say we call all Christians Jews, or we give up and we say no Christian can be Jewish. We're getting there in our world now.
Or we can say whoever wants to be a Jew is a Jew. We welcome you.
Yes, we
Without
could say
baptism.
that. We could say that. We could say that. But if we said that, there would be no way to defend that in the halakhic system.
Well, you found a way to defend women's ordination.
I know, but that's why you brought up the gay issue, because I couldn't find it there. Okay. And here, it affects Klal Yisrael in a way that neither of those does. You don't agree with me about women's ordination? Don't go to my shul where there's a woman rabbi.
Well, speaking of conversions, how do you view the Haredi control of religious institution in Israel, and what does it mean to our future relationship?
It's purely political. The reason they control it is because they are needed in every coalition. It upsets me no end. On the other hand, it has a certain benefit. That is, the type of issues that I was just talking about with you don't exist there. That's a benefit.
Fences to the Torah.
Yes. The problem is I don't like their fences.
Yes.
Right? But Golda Meir had the right answer to this. When conservative rabbi said this to Golda, she said, "Nu, make aliyah." And when the numbers of you who are in Israel are enough to have enough votes in the Knesset, we won't need them in the coalition.
She didn't say to the religious. She said
She said they're the conservatives who complained this about.
Yeah.
Look, I don't have a simple solution. Yeah. Am I upset with what they're doing at the Kotel? You bet. All the pictures of the old days at the Kotel, men and women were standing together. Yeah. No question about it. But this is not my top issue to be worried about. My top issue is to get a conservative Jewish constituency that observes Halakhah.
Wonderful. So we finished with that. We started with that, finished with that. I have one last thing that I ask my rabbis to do. And if you watched my program...
I don't sing. I have no nigunim.
So I have one rabbi who didn't sing, and until now I regret not pushing him.
Yaribon olam ve'almaya ve'almaya antu malka melech malchaya melech malchaya.
Where does it come from?
From the song called Yoribon. It's one of the Zmirot of Friday night.
At your home, what did your grandparents sing at Yutish?
My grandparents were not such Zmirah singers. I do not remember learning Zmiras from my grandparents. I learned them at camp.
In camp?
I learned them in camp, not at home.
Do you sing Zmiras at home?
On occasion, not always. It depends how late it is.
Well, there's still hope for you.
There may be hope.
Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure, my pleasure, my pleasure.